This more is Christian Leuprecht, an author and professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and Queen's University. Christian, thanks so much for your time. We know that this is, of course, a very fluid situation, but what more do we know about where things stand today in the Kursk region?
Well, we know that Putin is having significant challenges around the communications on this issue. It puts him in real predicament. He's always said the war is going according to plan. Of course, now he's declared a state of emergency, but he's again trying to downplay this by declaring the counteroffensive a counterterrorism operation as opposed to a state of war or some other sorts of measures. We do know that the Ukrainian forces are now running into very stiff resistance, but this is, of course, a fantastic reconnaissance and intelligence failure on the part of the Russian forces. And it's a big win for Ukraine simply on the information front, because, of course, everybody had said that Ukraine's forces are fatigued, they're running out of equipment, and so they can't mount counteroffensives, they can't actually sort of regain the initiative. And I think this is the point of what Ukraine is doing, demonstrating that they can still take the initiative in this fight.
So Vladimir Zelensky has now acknowledged the incursion. He says it's restoring justice and putting pressure on the aggressor. What sort of pressure is this putting on Putin, and what's Ukraine hoping to achieve throughout this battle?
Look, it's a great question, because I think many analysts in the West are a little bit puzzled as to what Ukraine is trying to achieve here. So one is that the Russians were playing an incursion in Kursk perhaps anyways, and so the Ukrainians basically tried to turn that around and use sort of offensive surprise to try to mitigate the any possible plans by the Russians. As has been widely reported, the Ukrainians may be looking to distract Russian forces who are fighting in the Donbass, but it appears that the Russians are basically pouring in conscripts and irregular forces to try to counter the Ukrainian incursion. So if that was the point so far, that appears not to have succeeded. It might also be that the Ukrainians are trying new joint arms warfare here. There's been reports of using drones to bring down at least one helicopter. But I think a lot of this is also perhaps trying to capture Russian soldiers that can be used in a future trade, and perhaps also trying to capture and retain territory that Ukraine might be able to trade should there be negotiations, because Ukraine has to hedge for the outcome of the US presidential election in November.
I think one thing is fair to say is that, you know, throughout the past 2 years, the Ukrainian forces should not be underestimated. But how long do you think that they can continue to hold ground in this area?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The Ukrainians need to demonstrate that they can actually make inroads with the weapons that the West has provided, because otherwise the rest will get even more reticent to provide supplies than they already are. And so the F-16s is one of the big debates about whether that will make a difference. It appears, based on intelligence reports, that the Russian offensive in the Donbass will accumulate in the next 4 to 8 weeks, because the Russians are simply going to run out of materiel and people. And as you know, the Ukrainians have been going heavily after Russian lines of communications, that is to say their supply lines, to make life very difficult for the Russian offensive. So the Ukrainians are trying to signal that with the right Western support, they can regain the initiative in this fight, even perhaps before the winter comes and sort of fighting stops for the season.
On the Russian side, what does this incursion say about Russia's intelligence and its vulnerabilities, and how embarrassing is this for Vladimir Putin?
So the Russians clearly demonstrate that they don't have the border particularly well defended. It shows, again, the sort of breakdown that you saw also during the 2023 revolt against sort of the Putin regime, the internal revolt by his own sort of militia. And so it suggests that the Russians have continued to have serious challenges on the intelligence and reconnaissance side. But it also suggests that perhaps overall the system is not as robust as Putin likes to make it out in terms of the Russian ability to continue to prosecute this war. And that's, of course, exactly the sort of holes that Ukraine is trying to poke in the Russian narrative and trying to provide considerable uncertainty for the Russian population. Conscript soldiers are going to be dying on the Russian side in this incursion. And of course, Putin has always said that these are people who would be spared in this sort of war. So this is very much about trying to undermine Putin's legitimacy in terms of what he's communicating about this fight.
All right, Christian Leuprecht, we appreciate your time today and your insights. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.